The failure of Mohammad Mossadegh's coup in 1953 would be followed by 26 years of relative stability of rule under the Shah. But that doesn't mean everything was all sunshine and rainbows. Far from it. Similar to Mossadegh, he would end up ruling unilaterally. He would try to modernize the economy and diversify it away from its dependence on oil, but a combination of social reticence and a seemingly insurmountable culture of petty corruption made this impossible. Expectations for a better future rose faster than the regime could deliver on, and the Shah wouldn't hold back from using the tools at his disposal to deal with dissent. This is the story of Iran under its last king of kings, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. My name is Grant, and you are watching Casual Historian. Let's get started. Based on the accounts of foreign leaders, the Shah was a personally charming person, and was seen as a force for progress in Iran. The Shah had always impressed me as a man of good intent, concerned about the welfare of his people. Though far from being a dictator, he possessed much more authority than any constitutional monarch of Europe. He did not hesitate to plunge directly into serious discussions, and impressed me as a man who was acquainted with each major problem of his nation and its relationship with others. And this opinion didn't change much in later administrations. America has little to be proud of in our reaction to his overthrow many years later. History is written by the victors, and the Shah is not much in vogue today. Yet it hardly enhances our reputation for steadfastness to hear the chorus today against a leader whom 8 presidents of both parties proclaimed, rightly, a friend of our country, and a pillar of stability in a turbulent and vital region. And the most common negative factor foreign leaders had to say about him was how assured of himself he was, and of what he said, even in contradiction of facts. The Shah seemed to think that because he believed something, it was automatically a fact. Although he may have been more open to the West than most Middle Eastern leaders, he was still prone to the same conspiracism. Despite lacking the ideological anti-Zionism of his Arab neighbors, he still believed in anti-Semitic conspiracies alleging Jews controlling the media and international finance.
In fact, he says American presidents and presidential candidates are too quick to do the bidding of the Jewish lobby.
Surely, Your Majesty, you're not telling me that the Jewish lobby in the United States pulls the strings of the presidency?
Not entirely, but I think even a little too much, even for Israel interests.
Why, if this is true, why would the President of the United States pay attention to that lobby?
They are strong.
Strong in what sense?
They are controlling many things.
Controlling what?
Newspapers, medias,
Your Majesty.
banks, finances.
He doesn't respond well to criticism, as in this 1976 interview where Mike Wallace reads a leaked CIA assessment of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
This secret study portrays the Shah as a brilliant but dangerous megalomaniac who is likely to pursue his own aims in disregard of U.S. interests.
So how could I be your man, your agent,
How do you mean?
safeguarding your interests?
Well, it says that the Shah is an uncertain ally. His dreams of glory apparently...
I know. So you would like me to be your stooge?
Do you want me to go on, or shall I forget about this, Your
Well,
Majesty?
to some funny points, why not?
Now, given the Shah's life up to this point, one can at least empathize with why he would think the world was out to get him. Foreign powers invaded his country and removed his father from the throne, survived several assassination attempts, and barely survived a coup attempt, all before the age of 35. Later in life, he seemed to rationalize all of these experiences as part of divine providence, believing he was chosen by God to do something important.
The only explanation, you said, I will stay alive until I finish what I set out to do.
What was set for me to do.
By God.
That's what I believe. Sometimes I have dreams which come true when I don't like it.
Assassination attempts?
No, not that.
But you had premonition, you had...
Not that. When I was a kid, once I dreamt that there was a pit full of snakes, and obviously people who are always translating the dreams told me that these are your enemies. Things like that. It happens to everybody, probably.
With that in mind, let's pick up where these previous videos left off. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had orchestrated a coup against the Shah after learning he was going to be dismissed from office. Local clerics across Tehran rallied their parishioners to take to the street to demand the Shah be restored, resulting in the army taking the protesters' side and arresting Mossadegh. Upon his return to the country, the Shah would appoint General Fazlollah Zahedi as prime minister. His top priority was restoring relations with the West, which meant completing the negotiations over the nationalization of Anglo-Iranian assets in Iran. After over 2 years of this, the British were certainly eager to finalize a settlement. I entirely agree that in everyone's interests, and particularly in Iran's, we must try to solve the oil question as soon as possible, always provided, of course, that this can be done without detriment to other vital interests. But I feel strongly that our immediate aim should be to reestablish diplomatic relations. The United States had begun providing monetary aid to the Iranian government, but they were slow-paced in order to incentivize Zahedi and the Shah to reach a deal quickly. The new agreement saw Anglo-Iranian compensated for material assets seized by the National Iranian Oil Company, and additionally, the UK offered to build rail lines in Iran in order to help get their oil back on the market quicker, which the British economy was dependent on at the time. The final deal saw the creation of an international consortium of oil companies called Iranian Oil Participants Limited, or IOP, modeled on the Aramco deal with Saudi Arabia, which had a 50-50 profit sharing. This new consortium was comprised of the American companies of Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, Texaco, and Gulf Oil, along with Royal Dutch Shell, the French state oil company, Compagnie Française des Pétroles, along with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which would be renamed British Petroleum. The NIOC would own the facilities, equipment, and the oil itself, but the IOP would handle operations, marketing, and international distribution, while the NIOC handled domestic distribution. In 1954, the IOP would be given a 25-year concession over territory in southwestern Iran, up for renewal in 1979. This new deal allowed the Iranian government to save face internationally, but domestically this was very unpopular, and so the Shah would spend the next quarter century gradually clawing back every bit of control over the oil industry that he could. One of the ways he did so was to make new deals with foreign oil companies to explore and develop oil resources outside of the consortium's concession, such as the deal struck with Italy's national oil company, Eni, who gave Iran 75% of the profits, which greatly angered the other oil companies, knowing that this would be the new starting point of future negotiations with Iran and all other governments in the region. The Iranian parliament would pass the Iran Petroleum Act in 1957, which would allow more companies into the consortium, thus weakening the bargaining power of all of its participants further. Iran would become a founding member of OPEC in 1960, which gave the Shah even more leverage over the IOP, which allowed him to further reduce the size of its concession, thus allowing the Iranian government more opportunities to allow foreign companies to compete and develop offshore sources. Oil became a bigger and more vital part of the economy over the course of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, growing from 45 million annually in 1950 to over 900 million by 1969, making up 67% of the government's revenue by 1965. The IOP was producing 1 billion barrels of oil a day by 1969, by which point the Iranian government had negotiated their share up to 61%. But for most of the 50s and 60s, there had been a glut in the oil market, driving down prices globally, which had helped fuel the economic recovery of both Japan and Europe after World War II. The U.S. Justice Department had initially opposed the creation of the consortium, fearing it violated antitrust laws, but the White House would tell the Attorney General to drop the cases out of national security concerns. But the oil glut that followed the consortium's creation angered smaller domestic producers of oil in the U.S., who lobbied Congress to place important restrictions on foreign oil, which were passed in 1956. In 1973, the Iranian government renegotiated the deal with the consortium, gaining full control of the oil fields, which was followed by a full renationalization of the oil industry in 1975. The 1973 deal was fortuitously timed because half a year later, war broke out between Israel, Egypt, and Syria. The Arab states that weren't directly involved in the fighting wanted the international community to pressure Israel into giving in to the demands of Anwar Sadat and Hafez al-Assad, so they agreed to embargo the sale of oil to all countries they saw as aiding the Israelis. This constricted the supply of oil on the global market, resulting in a sharp rise in oil prices, and thus shortages in much of the Western world. In the short run, this was ruinous for the countries participating in the embargo, with Iran being one of the few to benefit. Iran was one of the few OPEC countries to not participate in the embargo. Before the outbreak of war, oil had sold for under $2 a barrel, But at the height of the embargo, Iran was selling oil at $35 a barrel. The official OPEC price for oil had been raised to $5.03. But at a meeting in December 1973, Mohammad Reza Shah called for the price to be more than doubled to $11.65. 2 years earlier, President Nixon had announced the closing of the gold standard, which was followed by a depreciation of the dollar in hopes of encouraging American exports to reignite an economy that had already begun to slow down. This subsequently harmed the Iranian economy by making American imports more expensive, and so when Nixon, Henry Kissinger, and later President Gerald Ford had asked for the price of oil to be brought back down, the Shah was unsympathetic. That told us something. Demand for oil was so strong that price was no object. He seemed unconcerned about the havoc the oil price increases had already caused in the global economy, let alone what his extravagant proposals would generate. The oil crisis would skyrocket the government's revenue, with the annual budget growing from $8 billion in 1971 to $48 billion in 1977. Iran would become the fourth largest producer and second largest exporter of oil in the world, with it accounting for 70% of all foreign exchanges in Iran. The Shah would try to justify the rising oil prices to foreign journalists, claiming it would encourage the development of non-petroleum energy sources, thus allowing for a, quote, more sophisticated use of petroleum.
What's your view of that? Do you feel the United States is hostage to you and the other Middle East countries, the other OPEC countries?
To some extent, yes, because you are importing about 51% of your consumption of oil from that part of the world. And that is why I'm pleading, I'm almost begging the Western world to find new sources of energy.
Now, while much of the Arab world used their newfound oil wealth to furnish the lavish lifestyles of the monarchs, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi would use his oil wealth for a bit more altruistic pursuits. If our nation wished to remain in the circle of dynamic, progressive, and free nations of the world, it had no alternative but to completely alter the archaic order of society and to structure its future on a new order compatible with the vision and needs of the day. By 1953, Iran's agricultural industry was stuck in the Middle Ages, with subsistence farmers plowing small fields by hand, or if they were lucky, by donkey or ox, and paying rent to absentee landlords. The landlords owned large swaths of territory and collected rent from subsistence farmers living and working the land. This system generated enough revenue for the landowners that they didn't feel the need to invest in infrastructure or machinery to increase production and efficiency. On top of this, the peasants who worked the land lacked the capital and incentive to make those investments themselves, since any improved output would go straight to the landlord. This kept the country a net importer of grain from Russia for over a century. The Pahlevi Dynasty had wanted to drag Iran into the 20th century, and the first part of this was putting down the tribal leaders, at which, after suppressing their rebellions, their lands would be confiscated and placed under control of the crown. In the 1940s, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi would begin redistributing these crown lands to the peasants, hoping land ownership would incentivize improvement in the lands. This was done separately from the Iranian government, and during his period of rule by decree, Mohammad Mossadegh would implement a similar policy via the government itself, which would be undone after he was arrested. Land reform had to be put on the back burner after the failed coup, but the government focused on rebuilding the oil industry. But over the 1950s and early 60s, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Algeria would implement their own reform programs, redistributing lands from the old feudal lords to the peasants. The Shah felt the need to compete for legitimacy and leadership of the region, and in 1961, he would place his new Prime Minister, Ali Amini, in charge of that project. And you can help with future projects of this channel by joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member. These supporters keep the channel going when the algorithm or the sponsors don't feel like giving the videos a fair shake. And I would love to be able to depend on the direct support of viewers more so than AdSense. And I would like to thank the channel's newest supporters, The Backbencher 1296, Eleazar Novik, Seeker 42, Amesh, and a special thanks to the first producer level patron, Ryan Powers. Whereas most patrons and channel members receive a single thank you after becoming a channel member or patron, producers receive a verbal thank you in every video so long as they are a producer. And supporters get access to a number of other perks such as an exclusive Discord, early access to ad and censorship-free versions of the videos, and getting your names in the scrolling chyron at the end of videos. They also get access to a brand new perk, supporter exclusive videos, which include both monthly Q&A videos where you can ask me anything, as well as fully scripted history videos, which will come out at a bit of a slower pace. The first of these, which is about George Washington and the Battle of Fort Necessity, are already up on Patreon, as well as in the channel membership videos. And depending on what tier or level you join at, you can also get access to the scripts I use to make these videos, as well as the notes I use to write those scripts. But at the end of the day, I know that most people who support this channel, as well as support most creators through Patreon or channel memberships, do so not because of the perks we offer, but rather because you like what we create, you think it has value, and you want to help us keep making more or better. And with your support, we can. And the perks are ultimately just a way for us creators to thank you guys. So it feels like this is an actual exchange. So if you believe you get a lot out of these videos and you have the means to do so, then I would recommend becoming a patron or channel member. Click the join button down below to pick a tier, or go to patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. Thanks again to all the patrons and channel members for supporting Casual Historian. But for now, let's get back to the history. The parliament was filled with many of the landlords, or their representatives, who had opposed reform. So in 1962, the Shah would suspend parliament, which allowed the prime minister to implement the desired reform programs. The program itself was designed and managed by the agricultural minister, Hassan Arsanjani, which would redistribute state-owned land to peasants, as well as purchase excess lands held by private landholders. The law was first implemented in the Azerbaijan province, where land surveys assessed which individuals or extended families owned what land, and how much land each needed to part with. By 1966, 30% of villages in Iran had gone through the land redistribution. Land reform also included infrastructure projects for transportation, electricity, and irrigation, but they usually lagged far behind the same process in urban areas. Additionally, there was a mass literacy program where university graduates were drafted into the Iranian military and then deployed to rural villages to set up schools and teach peasants to read. And although Mohammad Reza Pahlavi seemed genuine about his desires for reform, the policies didn't have the desired results, at least not in time to save his regime. Not all of the land parcels were economically viable as farms, even if they had machinery, and most of the peasants couldn't afford that. And many of those who took out loans to buy the modern farming equipment ended up going deep into debt, to the point where many of them end up eventually having to sell off their land to a new class of landlords that was forming. Landlords who were, admittedly, building up larger, more productive farms. This also coincided with the courts frequently ruling that a piece of land had been wrongfully confiscated from its original owners, thus forcing the government to take land away from peasants and then give it back to some of the former landlords. These failures resulted in the government scaling back the program and allowing landowners to retain larger swaths of land. They even tried collectivizing these smaller farms into larger cooperatives, but most of these were not economically competitive. Villages with unprofitable farms became dependent on subsidized food and goods from the government. Peasants that sold off their land or defaulted on their loans would move to the outskirts of major cities like Tehran, forming dangerous shanty towns ripe for exploitation. A less talked about part of the land reform policies was a program of reforestation. Large swaths of Iranian forests had been chopped down in the 18th and 19th centuries, much of which was exported to Russia. The land reform laws would nationalize the few remaining woodlands left, along with additional lands intended for reforestation. Charcoal had been a major source of energy in rural communities and a major export other than oil. But to protect the forest, the government would ban the production of charcoal. This required the National Iranian Oil Company to distribute kerosene to the affected communities at artificially low prices to make up for the banning of their primary fuel source. By 1979, 9 million trees would be planted on 70,000 acres, with 98,000 acres of forest made into national parks. Although the land reforms didn't meet the intended results of the policy, food production did increase, and the literacy rate of people in the countryside did rise. Increased access to food and medicine lowered mortality rates in Iran, swelling the country's population. But land reform was one part of a series of reforms referred to as the White Revolution, the Shah's attempt at modernizing Iran in hopes of becoming a world power. Most OPEC members invested their money overseas. The Saudis invested in CDs and treasury bonds, while the Kuwaitis invested in the US and European stock markets. But Iran invested its oil money in military equipment and infrastructure. Chase had close relations with both the Saudi royal family and the Central Bank of Iran, and for years had helped both move their money through European accounts, which allowed them to evade oversight from the Federal Reserve, letting them invest in businesses in the developing world. Chase's presence grew in the Middle East during the oil crisis, and by 1975 they had established a presence in Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Iran. Chase's Iranian presence was established after a meeting between David Rockefeller and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in Switzerland, in which the Shah encouraged the banker to do, quote, something really big. So Chase would partner with the Industrial Credit Bank of Iran to form the International Bank of Iran, creating an opening for foreign investors to invest in something other than oil. The Iranian government would be advised by the Iran-U.S. Business Council, who held a conference in Tehran in March of 1976, chaired by David Rockefeller, with New York Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, Peter G. Peterson of Lehman Brothers, and Donald Regan of Merrill Lynch attending. But the conference's presenters found that the Iranian economy had little outside of oil that was of any value on the global market. The Iranians were not pleased with our findings. Hoveyda subjected us to an impassioned harangue for exporting a lack of morality to Iran, for bribing Iranian officials and then accepting kickbacks for multi-million-dollar military procurement deals. Hoveyda's remarks were a self-serving, gratuitous attempt to blame the West for problems that seemed to be deeply embedded in the Iranian system. Corruption is a perennial problem for Iran. It was a feature of the previous Qajar dynasty. It continued under the Pahlavis, and as history has shown, it has continued to persist after the Islamic Revolution. The attempts at dealing with corruption in the country in the 60s and 70s were a combination of genuine but misguided crusades, as well as show trials meant to eliminate rivals or people suspected of being disloyal to the Shah. The Shah had a hard time accepting accusations of corruption in his regime, being defensive or dismissive of the accusations, especially if they came from the foreign press.
But there are those from the West who say, look at the corruption in Iran. With all of the money in your own affluent economy, in your own swollen economy, so much money sticks to the hands of people in the government. They say you can't get a contract here, and everybody's here. You know that, vendors, contractors, without a little of true?
I think it's the most unjust thing that is said. It's just jealousy. For instance, the military purchases, it's government to government. If there is a corruption, it's from your government or the government of every other country from which we buy. So this is the unfairest and most unjust thing that I have heard.
Let me quote to you from a piece in the Washington Post. A wealthy Iranian businessman says, not a truck can move anywhere in this country without a payoff going to Princess Ashraf.
Who is this silly person who can believe that?
Why would you imagine this kind of thing would find its way into print?
First, you like to print those things. You newspaper people always must be sensational. And
you're satisfied?
One of your whipping boys today seems to be us in this country.
The industrial and land reforms were also paired with social and economic reforms, many of which were made in response to the negative externalities of the former reforms. Employment was made a right, with unemployed workers being guaranteed a minimum income until employment was obtained. All companies that were over 5 years old were required to sell 49% of their shares to its workers. This came alongside state-owned enterprises selling off 99% of their shares to the public. But most people couldn't afford to purchase these shares, and so the government provided loans to subsidize the purchase of those shares. But the oil money flushing into the economy, especially since the oil crisis, resulted in rapid inflation in an underproducing economy. And although the Shah was often criticized for how much he purchased foreign military equipment, this probably prevented further inflation due to the dollars going into foreign countries. But military expenditures weren't enough to prevent inflation rates of over 11%. The government tried to rein in inflation with price controls, but this resulted in thousands of businesses going under, unable to meet expenses at artificially low prices, which resulted in increased unemployment. Inflation ate into what little domestic manufacturing there was, with foreign-produced goods being cheaper than those produced at home. Price controls forced domestic manufacturers to reduce the quality of goods in order to make them cheap to still earn a profit, while some chose to reduce production, thus causing shortages and the growth of the black market. Food shortages, as well as power outages, became common. Their biggest problem is that they have the money, the materials, but not the trained manpower necessary to handle them. What is perhaps even more serious, the ministers are not sophisticated or experienced enough to cope with the added government complications which their sudden enormous wealth is bringing them. So as we can see, the Shah's domestic policy was a bit of a mixed bag. Progress was undoubtedly being made, but short-term consequences, exacerbated by the petty corruption of bureaucrats, made fast change unlikely. But on the foreign policy front, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi saw a gradual growth in his relative importance, seeing Iran become the preeminent power in the region by the late 70s. After relations were restored with the West in 1953, the Shah would turn his attention to the Soviet Union. The Azerbaijan crisis of 1946 saw the communists delay their withdrawal from the region in hopes of eventually annexing it into Soviet Azerbaijan, but international pressure forced the Soviets to pull out. Relations remained cold until the mid-1950s, when Mohammad Reza Pahlavi visited Moscow and hammered out a new treaty with Nikita Khrushchev, setting the border at the Arax River. They also agreed to several joint projects such as a hydroelectric dam along said river that would provide power to both Iran and Soviet Azerbaijan. The Soviets also provided advisors and technicians to set up mines, while also agreeing to allow products from the West to be shipped overland to Iran through Soviet territory. Through the rest of his life, Eisenhower would continue to praise how Iran was saved from communist takeover. And throughout the early years of the Cold War, the US was willing to overlook the tactics of organizations like the Savak, so long as they kept Iran out of the Soviet sphere. Any criticisms presidents did have with Iranian policies were usually brought up with the Shah in private meetings rather than broadcast to the media. The Shah would lobby the White House to let him buy more arms, but US administrations were initially reluctant. Firstly, they didn't believe that the Iranian military could stand up to a Soviet invasion by itself, even if it did have American weapons. Instead, they encouraged the Shah to rely on security guarantees from the US and to instead focus on suppressing a communist uprising through a combination of economic reform and military police. The US had no need for Iran to become the policeman of the Middle East, while the UK still had colonies and military bases in the region. But contrary to the regime's opponents, the Shah was not in fact a US puppet and acted against US interests all the time. After an attempt to militarily unify the Arab League failed, the British took the opportunity to form a new defense pact in the region in 1954. The Baghdad Pact, or CENTO, consisted of the UK, Iraq, Turkey, and Pakistan. Iran would join the pact in 1955 against US wishes, fearing the increased military spending would divert resources from needed economic reforms. Despite membership in the Baghdad Pact, Iran would side with the US during the Suez Crisis the next year. Although privately the Shah had supported an international third party controlling the canal due to his relations with Egypt having soured since the ousting of King Farouk in 1952, who had been the brother of his first wife, Fawzia. And in 1957, the Shah became a vocal supporter of the Eisenhower Doctrine, a policy of the US granting aid to any Middle Eastern power facing armed aggression linked to the communist world. Over the next year, a series of crises and coups hit Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, which led the US to fast-track the delivery of US arms to Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Ethiopia, Pakistan, and Iran. Iran also had foreign policy interests that didn't directly interact with the Cold War. They had territorial disputes in the Persian Gulf with Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Sheikdoms that would later become the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq. The Farsi and Arabi Islands were claimed by both Iran and the Saudis, but the Iranians militarily occupied both. In 1960, the dispute would be resolved, with the Iranians ceding Arabi Island to the Saudis. As the British granted independence to its last colonies in the Gulf and pulled out of its bases in the region, other territorial disputes erupted. The island of Bahrain had been an Iranian territory until the 19th century, when it came under British control. But Iran had never ceded its claim to the island, so in 1970, when the island was granted independence, the Shah agreed to recognize its independence in exchange for its annexation of 3 uninhabited islands in the Persian Gulf, which the UK agreed to. However, these islands were also claimed by the United Arab Emirates, who, as of writing, have continued to claim these islands. The most consequential territorial dispute was between Iran and Iraq. The two countries had been allies until 1958, when a coup overthrew and slaughtered Iraq's royal family, and tensions only got worse after the Baathists took power in 1967. The Baathists distrusted the Kurds in northern Iraq, who spoke an Iranian language, as well as the ethnic Iranians living in the south amongst the ethnic Arab Shia, whom they also distrusted. The Iraqis, under their new leader Saddam Hussein, were also using their oil wealth to build up their military, hoping to become the new leader of the Arab world after the death of President Nasser of Egypt. By 1970, the Baathists had expelled over 60,000 ethnic Iranians from Iraq, despite Iranian pilgrims being a major part of the economy of southern Iraq, visiting the various Shia shrines and cemeteries. In 1969, Iran declared the 1937 Sadabad Treaty, which gave Iraq full control of the Al-Arab River, null and void on grounds that it was an artifact of British colonialism, demanding joint control, setting a need to defend the Abadan refinery and the port of Khorramshahr. The Iranian military began providing weapons to the Kurds of northern Iraq, which eventually resulted in a revolt that came to a head in 1974, with Peshmerga fighters being sheltered in Iranian territory. But Iranian support for the Iraqi Kurds was entirely cynical, especially considering how they brutally put down their own Kurdish revolt in 1967. And throughout the early 70s, Iranian and Iraqi soldiers had sporadic skirmishes along the Zagros Mountains. The growing tensions would be temporarily resolved in 1975, when the Shah and Saddam met at the OPEC conference in Algiers, and agreed to split control of the Al-Arab River down its center, and to resolve all other territorial disputes later. Despite this, the Shah continued to see Iraq as his primary geopolitical threat.
Your Majesty, just looking at the countries that surround you, the Soviet Union, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Turkey, who all border on you immediately, most countries either make or buy arms with a particular potential enemy in mind. Now, who would be your particular potential enemies? Who would you be arming against, potentially or hypothetically?
As I have again said before, we have settled all our problems with, for instance, our neighbor Iraq. But the question remains the same. Today, they have more guns, tanks, and planes that we have, in addition to some weapons, very sophisticated weapons, that we don't even have one exemplary.
So Iraq would be one of the countries, although you have settled your problems at the moment, that is one you are potentially worried about.
That could be.
Their defining concern in their conflict with Iraq was access to arms, of which the U.S. were the primary provider. But the U.S. was slow to embrace this role for the Shah. Thanks to a concerted PR campaign, the American public saw the Shah as a force for progress and moderation in the region. But the American willingness to overlook human rights concerns began to shift under John F. Kennedy, who had criticized Eisenhower's foreign policy in developing countries. This is part of the reason why the Shah implemented the White Revolution and land reform when he did. He hoped to dissuade the Kennedy administration from cutting off foreign aid. The United States greatly appreciates the highly important strategic location of Iran and your steadfastness in remaining vigilant against the pressures of international communism. In deciding what we both can do to strengthen Iran's national security, however, it is also necessary that your urgent social and economic programs and the resources available to carry them out be taken into account. What really changed U.S. strategy in the region was the withdrawal of the British. Between 1968 and 1971, the British granted independence and withdrew their military from the rest of the Middle East. Most of these countries had small populations with little to no military, but a lot of oil. Back during the Great Game, the British had feared a Russian advance to the Indian Ocean through India, and a similar fear plagued the U.S. in the Middle East. By this point, both Syria and Iraq had become Soviet client states. And with the British leaving, the U.S. needed a new power to police the region on their behalf, while American forces were concentrated in Europe and Asia. In steps Mohammad, Reza, Pahlavi. This became the foundation of the Nixon Doctrine, a policy which called for the U.S. to help arm and train friendly and allied nations to defend themselves, but not use U.S. forces to defend those countries. This was a shift from the Eisenhower Doctrine, which had seen U.S. forces deployed directly to Lebanon in 1958. The U.S. would begin selling more weapons to Iran, with the implication being that the Shah would use them to help secure U.S. interests in the region. And thankfully for the U.S., many of their respective interests were aligned. Both Nixon and Kissinger got along with Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And during a visit to Iran in 1972, they quietly encouraged him to arm the Kurds of Iraq, seeing them as a useful asset against Soviet influence. The White House typically deferred to the Shah's expertise when it came to Middle Eastern affairs. He also played a role in opening up U.S.-Chinese relations by establishing relations themselves ahead of the U.S. and planting the seeds amongst Chinese diplomats. The Shah also fought against the expansion of communist influence in the Gulf when he sent troops into Oman in 1973 to help suppress the Dhofar rebels, which were backed by communist South Yemen, the Soviets, and China. Similar concerns over communist expansion also led to the Shah keeping a close eye on Afghanistan after its monarchy was overthrown that same year. But just as the US had warmed up to finally selling Iran the weapons it needed to protect itself against the Soviet invasion, they started receiving domestic pressure to restrict those sales. The cultural impact of the civil rights movement, combined with growing anti-war sentiments at home, saw more domestic opposition to supporting oppressive regimes abroad, and it became a political dividing line in the US. The Democratic Party came to oppose both U.S. interventionism abroad as well as propping up unsavory pro-American regimes, while the Republicans wanted to rely on these foreign regimes more as a means of reducing U.S. troop commitments overseas. To have failed to match the influx of Soviet arms into neighboring countries would have accelerated the demoralization of moderate forces in the Middle East and speeded up radicalization of the area, including Iran's. I dare say that it might have prevented or made far more difficult Sadat's later turn towards the West. The Shah wanted the newest weapons, hoping to stay militarily ahead of his nearby foes in Iraq, leading him to requesting the purchase of brand new F-14s, 15s, and 16s. The latter orders of F-15s and 16s would never be fulfilled as they were cancelled after the Islamic Revolution of 1979. But they would still end up being used against Iraq because they would be sold to the Israelis, who would use them in their 1981 Operation Opera, which destroyed Saddam's nuclear reactors, which you can learn more about in this previous video. This desire to furnish the Shah's military needs didn't disappear with Nixon's resignation, as President Ford wrote a letter to reassure him of U.S. support. In particular, I want you to know of the extremely high importance I attach to maintaining, expanding, and strengthening the very close ties and cooperation between our two countries. The special relationship between us has been built up through many trials over more than a generation. It has not only stood the test of time, but has grown stronger from year to year. I shall do everything in my power to foster the friendship between Iran and the United States. The weapons sales were at such a volume that Saddam Hussein demanded that the U.S. cease all arms sales to Iran and tied the reestablishment of U.S.-Iraqi relations to it. It was the eventual election of Jimmy Carter in 1976 that would see the brakes hit on these sales, but that's a story for a future video. And you can't talk about international relations in the Middle East without also talking about Israel. Iran had voted against the UN's partition resolution in 1947 in solidarity with the Islamic world, but the Shah wasn't as ideologically opposed to Zionism as the Arabs were. Iran still had a sizable Jewish population dating back to the time of Cyrus the Great, although many had converted to the Baha'i faith in the 19th century in order to escape legal persecution. And during the 1930s, Nazi propaganda incited a number of local pogroms. The Jews of Iran, like Jews in most Muslim-majority countries, supported Zionism, and after the establishment of Israel in 1948, many fled persecution in their home countries and resettled in the Jewish state. With most of the international animosity coming from the Arab world, Israel would try to develop stronger ties with the non-Arab countries and communities as part of their periphery doctrine, making Iran a natural ally. Both saw Iraq as a common threat, leading to the Savak and Mossad sharing intelligence, and both being involved in arming the Iraqi Kurds against the Baathists. Iran would never officially recognize Israel, but an Israeli business hired to help build irrigation systems would be allowed to set up an office in Tehran, which became their primary back channel to communicate with each other. The Shah also hoped that having friendly relations with Israel would improve their standing with the US, especially during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. But this was based on his conspiratorial perception that Jews had inordinate influence on the US government.
On the Middle East, the Shah is committed to a secure state of Israel, but he insists the Israelis must give back the Arab lands they conquered in 1967, and he believes the Jewish lobby in the United States helps breed Israeli intransigence on that matter.
Iran would supply Israel with oil and helped construct the Trans-Israel Pipeline, which took oil from the port of Eilat on the Red Sea to Ashkelon on the Mediterranean. Since Iran didn't participate in the OPEC embargo, they not only continued to sell oil to the United States and Europe, but also to Israel. They traded oil not just for money, but also for advanced weapon systems, doing even more so in the 70s after the US and Europe started to become more reluctant to. Among these weapon systems was missile manufacturing, with the intent that Israeli scientists would develop missile technology, the Iranians would build them, and both of their militaries would purchase these missiles from the joint firm. But this operation didn't become fully operational before the Islamic Revolution in 1979. But speaking of the Islamic Revolution, we should look at how politics was evolving in Iran under the Shah's reign. There were surprisingly few state retaliations after the coup. Tudeh party leaders and a few dozen regime officials were arrested, and the only execution being that of the foreign minister Hussein Fatemi. Mossadegh himself was placed on trial and imprisoned for only 2 years, after which he retired to his family estate under government protection until his death in 1967. Iran hadn't been particularly democratic before 1953, and afterwards the Shah slowly began to drop the pretenses. Over the course of the 1950s and 60s, the Shah centralized more and more policy making and governance into himself and the cabinet, and elections were rigged in order to turn the parliament into a rubber stamp. Candidates had to be approved by the regime and could only run within a government-sanctioned political party, and depending on the time period, this could be several or even none. His centralizing of authority resulted in the Shah expanding the number of cabinet positions, as well as the numbers of bureaucrats who had enough sway over government operations to earn bribes. In fairness to the Shah, this is how the Iranian government had operated long before the Pahlavi Dynasty came to power. So, in reality, it was really just more of the same. The Shah's goal was to fill his regime with apolitical technocrats who were loyal to him and effective at their job. This resulted in the appointment of numerous prime ministers until he finally settled on Amir Abbas Hoveyda in 1965, who'd serve in that office until 1977, making him the longest-serving prime minister in the country's history. Hoveyda and the Shah got along very well, in part because they were brother-in-laws, but more so because Hoveyda had no political aspirations of his own. Hoveyda was competent at his job, and no credible accusation of corruption has ever stuck to him, in part because the Shah personally oversaw so much policy duties and governance that he had no reason to engage in personal corruption. The regime would deal with corruption through sporadic show trials, allowing the Shah to eliminate people suspected of disloyalty. In order to prevent coups, the Shah ordered that all communications between officers in the military go through the palace, along with placing family and close friends in high-ranking positions. And most infamously was the creation of the Savak. The Savak was an intelligence and security organization within Iran. Imagine the CIA, FBI, NSA, and Secret Service rolled into one. It was formed in 1957, and in the early years it received a lot of training from French intelligence services, many of whom had experience dealing with the revolts in Algeria. There is debate over how involved the CIA was in the creation and training of the Savak. They definitely received money from the US to help establish it, but the Iranian government received a lot of US aid at this time across the board, so this wouldn't have been out of the ordinary. The Savak earned a reputation for brutality and torture, with opponents of the Shah's regime as well as leftists in the West insisting that the CIA must have taught them how to torture, but Iranian governments have their own long histories of torture, and certainly more so than the CIA would have had. And torture wasn't something unique to the Savak because it was a normal part of Iran's prison and justice systems. So yes, political prisoners would be occasionally tortured in Iran, but so would petty criminals. And Iran wasn't alone in this. In fact, most of the governments in the region had very similar practices. I don't say this to justify or whitewash the Shah's record, but as a historian, part of my job is to provide context. So did the Shah's Iran have a modern liberal sense of human rights? Well, no, but neither did Iraq, Saudi Arabia, China, or the Soviet Union. The records of many third world and most communist states are no better than that of Iran under the Shah. William J. Butler, an American lawyer with the International Commission of Jurists, wrote in a 1976 report that the Shah was way down the list of tyrants. He would not even make the A-list. The Savak was brutal, but not as brutal as the legends suggest. They only had about 3,000 full-time employees, utilizing a large number of informants, most of whom were former arrestees or their families. They would intentionally cultivate an image of themselves as harsher than they really were, in hopes of scaring dissidents into compliance before they needed to do anything at all. It was originally headed by General Taimur Bakhtiar, but he was dismissed in 1961 after he had secretly organized demonstrations against the attempts at land reform, as well as having secretly expressed interest in overthrowing the Shah to Allen Dulles, which the CIA would inform the Shah about. Bakhtiar would go into exile in Switzerland, where he linked up with other exiles and plotted the overthrow of the regime, only to be assassinated by the Savak in Iraq in 1970. After Bakhtiar's dismissal, the Savak would be headed by the Deputy Prime Minister, General Ni'matullah Nasiri, one of the officers that participated in the counter-coup against Mossadegh. As time went on, the Shah's regime began to receive international criticism as well, which the Shah resented, sounding more and more like Mohammad Mossadegh. From the moment that Iran became the master of its own underground wealth, a systematic campaign of denigration was begun concerning my government and my person in certain of the mass media. It was at this time that I became a despot, an oppressor, a tyrant. Suddenly, malicious propaganda became apparent. Professional agitators operating under the guise of student organizations appeared. Similar to Mossadegh, the Shah would accuse all opposition to his rule as being backed by foreign influences, and the Savak would mirror the Shah's conspiracism, becoming paranoid of any initiative made within their own ranks independent of the Shah's orders. Despite their deliberate targeting of leftists, they usually suspected that they were being backed by the British or Americans. I cannot help but believe that the oil companies and an organization like the CIA were somehow involved in fomenting and financing this campaign against me.
Would demonstrating, like the people here in Williamsburg are doing today and they're planning to do in Washington tomorrow, would that be considered a crime in Iran?
Not simple demonstration. That depends what they would say. If they say things that are forbidden by the law in the country, obviously they will be prosecuted. Otherwise, no.
Well, so I'll understand this, and the American audience understand what is considered a crime punishable by jail in the political area in Iran. For instance, is to criticize you personally. Is that a crime punishable by imprisonment?
That depends what it is said. But what is outlawed in our country, it's communism.
It's communism.
Yes.
With Iran, the secular opposition mostly consisted of socialists and communists, largely former members of the Tudeh party and their children. They occasionally orchestrated protests and attempted to assassinate regime officials. By the late 60s, they had started forming terrorist and guerrilla cells to perform attacks against regime targets. But they tended to be disorganized, and most numbered no more than a dozen people due to them being highly suspicious of Savak informants. This resulted in them turning on each other, accusing the others of being moles. Sometimes these were genuine accusations, and other times they were cynical power plays. The religious opposition was a bit more coherent. The clerics had sided with the Shah in 1953 in protest of Mossadegh not keeping his promises to them about enforcing their brand of Sharia on Iran. The Shah was a more inherently conservative force than the reformers, so the clerics hoped that he would fulfill their goals, but they would become disappointed with them as well. The Shah would view both the communists and Islamists with suspicion, dubbing them the Black and Red Alliance. This resulted in him also going after the followers of the Islamic fundamentalist Ayatollah Kashani. And as attempts at economic modernization were made, the leftist critiques about consumerism and Western decadence would be adopted by the Islamists. The land reform laws were especially unpopular with the clerics and the traditional landowners, who donated large sums of money to religious institutions. One of the leaders of the movement against land reform was Ruhollah Khomeini, a student of Ayatollah Borujerdi. The government was holding a referendum on the Shah's white revolution policies in 1963, and Khomeini would lead a boycott in protest of it allowing women to vote. A rebellion broke out in Fars, which the government suspected Khomeini was involved with. Pro-Khomeini demonstrations broke out in Qom in March, which saw them clash with police and soldiers. On Ashura of that same year, Khomeini gave an inciting sermon, which condemned government corruption and social liberalization. A recording of the sermon was spread across the country, sparking riots and looting, with a mob marching on the palace in Tehran. Martial law would be declared and soldiers sent to disperse the crowds, killing at least 125 people over 2 days, and some accounts suggesting as high as 400. Khomeini would be placed under house arrest after the riots, but was allowed to return to Qom after 8 months due to pleading from other ayatollahs. Khomeini would deliver more speeches calling for the abolishment of the reforms as well as the parliament, and denounced the government as agents of Zionism. He He also began encouraging vigilante violence against American advisors working with the Iranian military. He was arrested again, and when he refused to retract his statements, he was punished with exile, spending most of the next 14 years living in Iraq. Following his exile, his followers would assassinate the Prime Minister Hassan Ali Mansour in 1965. While living in exile, Khomeini made numerous plots wanting to spark a Shia revolt against the monarchy. He continued his writings while in exile, with recordings of his sermons smuggled into the country. Islamist militancy would grow alongside that of communists throughout the late 60s and 70s, as the Western world became more self-conscious about what regimes they were willing to prop up. Unbeknownst to everyone, the inauguration of Jimmy Carter as President of the United States would mark the beginning of the end for the Pahlavi Dynasty, and the beginning of the modern era of the Middle East. I'd like to thank Ryan Powers again for his producer-level support over on Patreon. If you are interested in supporting these videos as well, you can go to patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. If you have any questions about the video or suggestions for future video topics, feel free to leave those down in the comments below. If you want to dig deeper into any of the topics of this video, my sources as well as all of my footnotes are listed down in the description. If you're interested in learning more about modern Middle Eastern history, I recommend watching the supercut of my 1953 coup in Iran series right here, or you could check out my latest video here. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.